Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Hilary Powell, and I'm here to present on navigating caregiver stress and wellness in a three-part mini-series. So we know that caregivers provide an incredible and necessary support to their loved ones. And we also know that caregiving can present a wide array of stressors that can feel insurmountable. This stress can lead to a phenomenon known as caregiver burnout, which is defined by the American Medical Association as a state of physical, emotional, or mental exhaustion that can create negative and unconcerned caregiver attitudes. What's more, burnout can be incredibly distressing for a caregiver. It's associated with feelings of guilt, depression, and anxiety. So in this mini-series, I'm going to be talking about how stress impacts caregivers, and I'll be giving you some tools from the field of mental health for combating stress, preventing burnout, and promoting wellness in your own life. So this is just an overview of where we'll be heading in this series. So in this first chapter, I'm going to be covering what stress is, what it actually does for us, and what happens when it gets to be too much. In later chapters, I'll talk more specifically about what caregiver stress can look like, what some of those unique experiences are. And in our last chapter, I'll talk a little bit more about things that you can do, action steps that you can take for taking care of yourself. All right, so when we start talking about stress, we got to start at the beginning. And the beginning is really dispelling a common notion that people have about stress. Understandably so, the notion is that stress is bad. But what we know in reality is that stress is normal and adaptive. It's our way of responding to life's challenging events. So I want you to imagine a specific stressor here. And not just any stressor. I want you to imagine that you go out for a walk and you see a bear. Think for a minute here about what you'd be feeling, what would be coming up in your body. This is the stress response. And let's break it down a little bit. So when I think about stress, really when I think of any of our emotions, I often break them down into four major components. So let's do this with the stress response. So again, be keeping in mind that example of seeing a bear. So there are going to be a lot of physical body responses. If you're anything like me, your heart is going to be beating out of your chest. It's scary to see a bear. And in Hawaii, I would imagine it's very unexpected. So we're going to think that if you see a bear, if you're experiencing the stress response, you're going to experience things like your pulse increasing, your eyes dilating, your digestion slowing, your breath quickening, and your muscles getting tense, okay? Getting tense, ready to act. That's what we want from the stress response. There's also going to be an emotional component of this. So if you see a bear, you're probably going to be emotionally feeling a lot. You might feel afraid. I know that I would. You might feel anxious, like that bear is not supposed to be here. You might feel overwhelmed, like you can't handle the situation. You might feel hopeless. You might feel helpless. And what's likely happening in the case of seeing a bear is that there's some stuff going on cognitively. So when I say cognitive, I'm really talking here about thoughts specifically. So if I saw a bear, I'd probably be thinking about the worst case scenario. Oh my gosh, I was not expecting this bear. What if I can't get out of here? What if I'm walking my tiny little dog and she's at risk of being eaten by this bear? I'm going to be focusing on the negative. I'm going to be predicting the future. These kinds of stressful thoughts can be helpful. They can help to mobilize us and to get us through a situation. They're also really distressing. They can amp up that initial stress response. And then finally, the fourth ingredient here when we're thinking about different emotions, and here when thinking about stress, we have to be thinking about behaviors. So with behaviors, I'm talking really about physically what do you see me doing, but I'm also talking a little bit about those urges to act that are coming up in my body. Now, the classic stress response in an overwhelming, stressful situation is fight, flight, or freeze. So we want to kind of fight our way out, run our way out, or sometimes we freeze up. With stress, this can also look like agitation or restlessness. Hopefully, if you see a bear, you know to make yourself big and talk loudly and walk backwards. Maybe you have some bear spray or have some other evidence-based tips for getting out of that situation, but you're going to be getting out of that situation. This is what the stress response is doing for us when we're seeing this really scary, acute stressor of a bear showing up. So you might be catching on so far, but I'm making the argument here that stress is beneficial. It helps us. So I'm going to present to you something that we call the anxiety curve. But you can think about this in stress, generally speaking, not specifically that emotion of anxiety. So the anxiety curve, we understand that some stress is beneficial. And we can imagine, right? So let's say we see a bear. Well, if we're too relaxed over here on this end of the curve, so we see not a lot of anxiety earlier on. Well, if we're too relaxed, this is also associated with poorer performance. So essentially what that means here is if you're walking down the street and you turn around a corner and you see a bear, and you're just like, oh, hey there, Mr. Bear, how you doing? Well, that's not the response you want to have if you see a bear. That gives the bear time to attack you. We need a little bit of stress. That's where we get to this peak arousal and performance piece. We see here we're at halfway across this anxiety axis. So that means that our anxiety or stress is pretty well building. Well, that's associated with a good amount of performance, right? I'm stressed. I see a bear. I know what I need to be doing in this situation. And it's getting big, talking loud, walking backwards. Oh boy, I better do this well. I can't mess this one up. We want that stress to get us out of the situation. Of course, stress doesn't feel good. And at its worst, we can feel so anxious, so stressed that we can't even focus on the task at hand. That's where we get this upside down U-shaped curve that's associated with anxiety, that's associated with stress and performance. So let's say I see that bear and I'm so stressed, I'm so overwhelmed that I curl up in a ball on the ground and I start crying. Oof, I can't do anything, I'm immobilized, right? We see that's also not associated with good performance over here, right? Because we're too stressed to act. We want stress to help us perform, to help us get out of a bad situation. It's beneficial. Too little stress can mean that we're too relaxed in the face of life's challenges, but too much stress can also mean that we're too overwhelmed to do anything. So let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in the body when we're experiencing stress. So typically when we model stress, we understand that stress begins in the brain. So once we perceive danger, a brain area known as the amygdala, which is a little bit more in the center of the brain. And this amygdala kind of acts like a smoke detector, right? When it senses any smoke at all, it flashes. Ooh, there's a threat, there's a danger. What happens after the amygdala picks up on the threat is that it starts to communicate with other areas of the brain, such as the hypothalamus, which communicates with places like the frontal lobes. So this is all to say, in this process, after that alarm is activated, that amygdala is activated, the rest of the brain is appraising whether or not is this actually a threat, right? With a smoke detector, we need to appraise as humans, is it just that Hillary left a pot on the oven a little bit too long, or is there actually a fire? Well, the brain is doing something really similar in this situation. So from there, once the brain appraises, yes, this is something to be concerned about, what's going to happen then is that the brain will communicate with our nervous system more broadly by sending signals through what's called the autonomic nerves to the adrenal glands. So what happens in this process is that the nervous system triggers the release of something called epinephrine. Epinephrine is colloquially known as adrenaline, that kind of heart pumping response. So our body is flooded with this epinephrine. What happens in this situation is that it's kind of like the gas pedal is getting pressed to the floor. Oof, that foot is down. We are in go mode. This is the first response to stress. What happens after this initial surge, however, is that something called the HPA axis prompts the release of the hormone cortisol via a series of kind of adrenal interactions in the body. And what happens with cortisol is that this then floods the body, but it stays in the body. So with the release of cortisol, with this staying in the body longer, it's kind of like, oof, that gas pedal that's been kind of pushed to the floor is now being held down. Now this two-part response is important for our safety. So initially we need that surge of epinephrine to get out of the challenging situation. But we're not necessarily safe as soon as we start running. We have to run. We have to get out of there. We need a longer lasting response. And this is where the cortisol kicks in. Now, here lies the problem. What we see when we look at modern life, and more specifically, what we see when we look at the demands of caregiving, is that we're not usually stressed about things like bear attacks. Life as a caregiver includes many chronic stressors, things that kind of persist in our lives. These might include things like managing chronic conditions, navigating financial pressures, balancing career and caregiving, and coping with a global pandemic. There's a lot going on with caregiving that doesn't just let up. Now you may have noticed that the stress response I've talked about so far is meant to help us get out of an acute situation, one distinct period in time, get away from that stressor. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens when the stressor isn't something that we can necessarily get away from, or maybe even more specifically, it's not something we want to get away from. It's actually something that we want to move towards. So with that acute stress response, we can find it to be helpful, again, to get out of negative situations. So if we're looking at time here on this bottom axis, and then stress here on this vertical axis, we can see that as time happens, we might experience a stressor. We see that bear. Ooh, stress. Okay, I'm safe now. And then what can happen again is, oh, okay, now it's a lion. Oh, I'm stressed. I'm getting out of here. Oh boy, okay, okay, I'm safe now. Our stress levels return to baseline. Now what happens with chronic stress is that we don't necessarily get that opportunity to return to baseline. And what happens is that our levels of stress actually build over time. We see this increase happening here. So we experience one stress. Okay, we find out that Dad's sick. He's not feeling well. Oof, I'm stressed. Okay, we got dad to the doctor. Things are feeling good. Oh no, another complication. I got the bill. How do I cover it? Okay, I did that. Oh no, and another thing, and another thing. And what you might notice here is that we don't return to our baseline level of stress. And what happens is if we're already elevated in terms of our stress response, the next stressor can kind of push us off the charts because we're already so elevated at baseline. We don't have a chance to relax, and stressors feel more and more overwhelming because our stress response is already kind of blaring. It's already happening in our body. So I want to come back to those 4 ingredients for an emotional response that I talked about earlier. So if we think back to these elements, like this physical response, this physical stress response, but if we think about it not in the case of a bear attack, but in the case of the chronic stress that comes up with caregiving, we can see that things like having an increased pulse and having your muscles all tense would be happening almost all the time. Maybe you notice that now. And actually, I'm going to ask you to even check in on your body. What are you feeling? Are you noticing tension in your stomach, in your neck? I get it a lot in my jaws. I clench my teeth. That kind of chronic muscle strain can be problematic over time, right? It's easier to get a pinched nerve when we're constantly kind of tensing up our bodies because we're constantly stressed. Things like that fear response, that anxiety response that would be helpful in seeing a bear because it would help mobilize us. Well, this can look like feeling anxious all the time, constantly feeling overwhelmed, feeling totally hopeless in your situation. Again, while these are mobilizing with an acute, immediate stressor, if you're constantly feeling this way, we see it taking big toll on your mental health. Now let's look at those thoughts, right? With the bear, I might have those worst case scenarios. Like, well, what if I go to run and the bear runs after me? Well, that's helpful because then I can plan, well, what if? What do I do? But if I'm constantly predicting the future, imagining these catastrophes occurring, this kind of negative thinking is going to further exacerbate, further worsen how I'm feeling. And behaviorally, that agitation, that restlessness that we have associated with stress, well, if it's coming up regularly and chronically, well, I'm never going to be able to relax. And over time, I might even forget how to. So by this point, you might be picking up on the idea that chronic stress is a lot to handle. It's not just a little anxiety that you can brush off. It actually has a full body, full person impact. But more so than that, I want to speak here to the health impacts it can have when we're thinking about even medical complications. So we know that chronic stress can weaken the immune system. It can intensify chronic pain. It can increase our susceptibility to chronic conditions like gastrointestinal issues and high blood pressure. And it can intensify or trigger mental health issues like depression or insomnia. Altogether, this chronic stress that can come with caregiving can have big impacts on our health, both our physical health and our mental health. It's an important thing for us to be looking at and thinking about how can we minimize some of the stress that we're experiencing, even with the difficulties and complications that come with caregiving. So in my next part of this mini-series, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically, what are the stressors that caregivers experience? And then then in the last part, I'm going to come back to tools that you can take away for actually de-stressing and promoting wellness in your life.
Thank you to the Hawaii Resiliency Fund through the Hawaii Community Foundation for their generous support for the College of Caregiving series with the Caregiver Foundation. We're grateful for all that you do.